The lecture is the early history of the Northwest Mounted Police and the trail. And the presenter tonight is Larry Hamilton. And Bruce Donaldson will be introducing Larry. But just before Bruce comes up to introduce him, it's wonderful to see so many of you here tonight. And we hope that some of you will feel inclined to take out a membership here and join the Charleswood Historical Society, because we would really like some new members. And yes, we're an interesting group, and we're sure you'd enjoy it. Bruce is a provincial historian, now retired, and yeah, he'll tell you the story of Larry and Bruce, and yeah.
Well, thank you for the introduction. It's a pretty grandiose title.
Can you hold it closer, Bruce?
Yes, okay. I started work for the province in 1982, I guess, and I became the Chief of History Research and morphed through a whole bunch of titles, and I retired in 2009 at 55 years old. Anyways, enough about me. I guess I first met Larry probably in the late 1980s. There was a professor at the University of Manitoba in political science, Professor Alan Keir, who was very interested in the march west of the Northwest Mounted Police in the early 1870s, the Fort Dufferin site in Emerson, which is a National Historic Site, and which I was involved in helping designate a Provincial Historic Site. And the Mounties marched west from there, I won't go into the history, to Fort Macleod, Alberta, in present-day Alberta, then the Northwest Territories. Anyways, I became involved in the late 1980s, and my main involvement was, you'll see this red sign here, Boundary Commission Northwest and NWMP, Northwest Mounted Police Route. A fellow named Felix Keene was president of the Northwest Mounted Police Boundary Commission Trail Association. And that group represented historical societies, museums, municipal councils from 26 municipalities from Emerson to the Saskatchewan border. I guess my role at the time was to coordinate getting approval through the Department of Highways at that time. It was called Department of Tourism, Natural Resources because of the provincial parks, and our department for this name, for the design of the highway signs, etc., etc., etc. And it was a long process. One of the things I clearly remember is Felix being in our office. We were temporarily at the corner of on Broadway and Smith Street in 1993, and I had him in there. He phoned every municipal councillor, reeve, mayor, secretary, treasurer of 26 municipalities. We needed all of them to sign on to agree to this design for signs and the route. I guess my other vivid memory was flying down there to Killarney, I believe it was, with 3 cabinet ministers back to unveil the sign. I can't remember now. I guess I should have went back and checked the files. Anyways, I'm going on and on here. I'm sorry. But I met Larry back, I guess, in those days. And one of the things I dug out today is Larry was a teacher and principal of an elementary school in Crystal City. And I guess in 1993, our second son, Wesley, we went out there one day, and there was a historic site mirroring her school, and they had an entire day with classes in a one-room school, and he still talks about that. So Larry's been involved in history and heritage, well, for as long as I can remember. And anyways, I will now introduce Larry, and again, my apologies for rambling here.
Now, I think my discussion tonight is going to be likely as full as the walls you see in front of you, as full as the den that my wife thinks that we are downsizing. And so please be prepared to know more than you ever wanted to know about the RCMP tonight. I was told to take about an hour. Well, we're starting a little late, so I'm going to hold to that because I prepared a fair amount of things, but I'd hate to leave any. I don't know what I would cut out. It's like saying you have something in front of you and what are you going to cut off? Well, we'll just do the best we can to share as much information as possible. Now, first of all, I just want to check, the last time I was here, it was a little hard to hear at the back. Is everyone able to hear okay, that's good. Because it's no sense, it's one thing to not enjoy it when you can hear it, but if you can't hear it, well then you don't even have a chance. So that's what we want to get. Now I'm just going to start right away and then we'll deal with some of the artifacts that I've brought and so on. And this podium is going to be interesting. Okay, first of all, it is an honor to be invited to present to the 6th Heritage Lecture Series, and I was a retired teacher and principal and have had my share, had asked to share my view about the RCMP as they've introduced already. My interest in the RCMP came as I worked to uncover my own family history, and over the years since 1973, when I started to get interested in it, which was the 100th birthday of the RCMP. It was my first year of teaching in Lundar, Manitoba. Before the start of the school year, my brother and his wife went to Regina, and that was the main celebration for the RCMP that year. The Queen and Prince Philip were there, and she was presented with a horse named Centennial, which she would ride in London for many years. The Queen brought the RCMP a new standard at that time, and John Diefenbaker and his wife were there as well. I was honored to meet them and discovered that his wife, as we talked as they walked in front of the hotel, was from Roland, Manitoba. She went to Miami, my hometown, for Saturday shopping. Well, that was a fine coincidence, and an autographed photo of Diefenbaker came to me later, which I have tonight, and was one of my delights. I further celebrated the RCMP with my class, and I met another newcomer to the community that year. His name was Brakefield Moore. He was not only in his first year of the RCMP and first year of a new job like I was, he was very interested in the history of his RCMP group. He had some pictures, and I have brought some of them tonight to display. I got my own copies. They were from a paper company in the United States, and if a teacher or educator would write, they would send them to you free. So every year I wrote and pretended that I didn't have any and got a few more. And I've put up a few of them, and they are indeed unbelievable. Friedberg was the artist, and for 40 years he painted over 300 pictures of the RCMP force. He came to Canada from the United States to get uniforms and photographs and draw equipment and see horses and how they rode them, so his pictures would be accurate as possible. A Mountie quoted, "The artist gets every detail and he captures the very spirit of the force, of its past and its present. He captures the way we feel and when we are on duty, and it is indeed remarkable." For the 125th anniversary of Friedberg, I was commissioned to paint a picture that would commemorate the long history of the RCMP. I have a small frame copy over there of the picture, and they describe it as the strong realism seen in the commanding figure riding and the mounting stands in contrast to the very visionary riders in the sky that bring back memories of the many Mounties that have gone before and established with courage and devotion the traditions of the force. Lettered on that picture also are all the Canadian provinces and territories. And if you look at any of the pictures, the paintings, you can see the face of the Mountie is such that he's determined, he's proud, he's what a true Canadian maybe would be, and so you can enjoy those. And I particularly like the ones with the native people. Well, all of them are very well done, but they're just incredible, the pictures that he has created. During my first Christmas vacation, I journeyed to Vancouver and visited with my 93-year-old great-grandmother. Her mother was there because I had treated my grandparents to a free trip to Vancouver on the airplane with my first money that I received as a teacher. It was fun to see them together, and this is when I started writing my family history. I wanted it to be fair, and so I wanted to meet my grandparents, my grandfather's parents as well. And so the following year, I journeyed to Laurel, Ontario, where his family had come to Canada in 1832. I visited there twice, once with my wife later, and we got a chance to see the original home that they built in 1832 out of logs, and found out that one of the original Mounties was indeed one of my relatives. So it again enhanced my interest in the Mounties and so on. Then things seemed to just happen just by luck for me, and it all clicked in. And so in 1989 it continued when I got a letter in the mail, and it invited me to a meeting. And I didn't know how they got my name or where it came from, and it was about the RCMP, and they were trying to form a group to study the RCMP and to honor the trail, which I knew nothing about. I had lived in Lundar and then moved to Crystal City, and so that the RCMP had started their march from Emerson, but I didn't even know that, and that they had marched across the country. And so the group was starting to raise interest in those early days in, like I say, 1989, for that kind of thing, and get people in the communities more involved and more saying, hey, you have some history here. And so that's how I got involved, and I went to the meeting, and well, never looked back since, and it turned out to be a very thrilling situation for me. Now, then I started to research the RCMP myself, and wanted to use it in my classroom, and I found out that the trail that the RCMP traveled on was used by a variety of people and creatures throughout time. The buffalo, the native people, the fur traders, the explorers, the Boundary Commission, the Northwest Mounted Police, the settlers, the present-day highways, tourists, and now today local travel. All of those groups used the same trail. And if the animals had not made it, they would not have gone there. And each passerby made it easier for the next generation of creatures or humans to travel on it. And so therefore, it just was the trail. And yes, there are many more trails, but this is one of the main ones from Emerson across to the west. And many people came in from around the country to get to Emerson. That was a sort of a stopping off point. And then they fanned out across the country. And to say, well, why did they have to use a trail? Well, you just don't strike off into the bush or into the grassy prairie, because you would end up, we say we can get lost in a snowstorm just 5 feet from our car. Well, those people would have been lost too. Now, the buffalo and animals created the trail as they followed and made it to go to water. And they're going to go to the most level situation. They're going to go where there's more water every time. And so that's where the trail was created at the beginning. Native people followed it to get water themselves. They hunted animals and found plants. Seasonally, they moved into winter camps there. They traded with other groups. Fur traders then came, and they indeed used Indian guides. And the Indian guides led them along the same trail. Native knowledge of each other and the land and the plants and animals and medicines and travel like canoes and snowshoes were invaluable to the new settlers and their total survival. Later on, the fur traders showed other explorers how to go there, and the tired true routes became even more used. The travelers, the native guides, supported the newcomers, expanded the new land, and shared their knowledge, and traded and hunted or mixed with new groups. And so the trail and the hunters then met other Indian people which they had never met, and it further fanned out and brought companies and groups or communities together. Prehistoric native burial mounds were found along the trail as well. There's one at Darlingford that you can visit, Pilot Mound, and Snowflake. Those mounds are still visible today, and I don't know all the history of them, but they're indeed chiefs. One of them has more chiefs buried in than another, and smoke signals were sent between those hills because they are fairly close to each other in those small rural towns. Then after its time, Manitoba was created in 1870 and was just a postage stamp corner, and you can see the map here. Here's Manitoba. This was the size of Manitoba in 1870. Crystal City is just a few miles from one of the edges, and we put up a monument there to denote where beyond Crystal City, it was the Northwest Territories. So this was Manitoba. Ontario was a little small province at that time, Quebec the same. The rest of this was all the Northwest Territories. This was Manitoba, nothing else. BC was a little corner later on, but Manitoba in 1870 was just this little square, postage stamp province. Now, after that, they decided after the Civil War, the Canada, John A. Macdonald decided that it was very important to get the border set up. And it's been talked for years about having it lower in the Dakotas, higher halfway up Manitoba, and so being typically Canadian, we agreed on a compromise and we went in the middle. So the 49th parallel was chosen. Now, the Boundary Commission group went through and made mounds such as this at the beginning to denote where the border was. They also, as I will read here in a minute, did other things, but this is one of the pictures of one of the mounds that they, and just imagine like us to dig a little hole to bury a little bird that passed away in our family takes a while. So doing this, and I started a swimming pool in my own yard at home, and it just got to be a little small hole as big as my hand, and that's as high as I got. But, so doing that, of course, would be difficult. Now, it was, so Great Britain and Canada and the United States were working together to get the 49th parallel set up. The border was measured and marked, a plowed strip on each side of the line as a fire guard to make no mistake where the two countries actually were. Hundreds of surveyors, geologists, and geographers worked in 1873 and 1874 to create that new line. Also included was a road building gang whose members cut grades for river portages, built bridges for the wagons, horsemen, and livestock used to travel. Fragments of their trail are still visible today along Highway 3. Now again, they followed the same trail the buffalo, the native people, and the fur traders used. It was okay to say where the 49th parallel was, but until it was literally on the ground, it was difficult for people because they wanted to know whether their home, their farm, or their field was in the United States or Canada. And I've heard that there is some post office or stores or something that half of the building is on the United States and half of the building is in Canada. So you need to have those kinds of things fixed up over time. Next came the Northwest Mounted Police. John and MacDonald began the force in 1874 and later sent them to the Yukon in the Gold Rush days. There were 300 men hired in the beginning, and I'll tell a lot more detail about them in a few minutes, and they began from Fort Dufferin and, as Bruce mentioned, went all the way to Alberta to establish a force in this country. Following the Northwest Mounted Police, the settlers, our families, came from Europe. And it doesn't matter what era that your families came in, if they came into the West, this is one of the routes they would have traveled. They would go along the trail and maybe branch off and set up a town, but they always would come back to the trail to get supplies. Say at Emerson, a lot of things would come into Emerson. I heard of a man who wanted to buy a stove. There was no way to get a stove. He walked from his home near Crystal City and walked to Emerson. Now, I forget how long that took him. He got the pot belly of the stove and brought it back on his back, walked back the next day to get the pipes. And so it just, like those kinds of things, using a wagon. He has a wagon when he comes out from Emerson to make a new homestead, and for the first winter, he can't get a house built fast enough because there isn't good enough trees. He digs a hole in the ground, puts the boards of the wagon over the dirt, and that's his little house for the winter. So those kinds of things, like, as I used to tell my students, I love talking about these stories, but in pioneer times, I'd have been dead in 2.5 minutes. I can't even hardly strike a match, let alone do what they were doing. So the settlers then, as Bruce was saying, there's the historic sites along the trail today to denote where they came and the towns that they established. The present-day roads and highways, we travel on them and we don't think anything about it, and unless they are indicated, which they weren't prior to this particular sign showing the way, it was something that was, you just wouldn't understand or appreciate. This is who went here before me. Today, tourists and local travel back and forth, and they don't think either about the trail they're going on that the animals first created. Now, I just wanted to highlight why this trail is so important, and that's what it's all about. All of these people, all of these creatures, all of these just used that highway and went there about their business. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the RCMP and how they came here and what they did, and I've got a lot of detail, and some of it you'll say, well, that's interesting to me, and so hopefully one little kernel will hit you on the head. The RCMP paved the way for the settlement and expansion of the West. The force is respected internationally and played an important role in the Canada we know today. It all began in 1869 with the Hudson Bay Company. And I didn't note that I have the buffalo and the buffalo head here, and please don't touch that little gentleman because he will break in about 1,000,000 pieces. He's old, and the buffalo robe is from my wife's grandmother. She used to wrap herself with it, and it's out of Montana. So each of these items are to indicate part of the story. The Hudson Bay Company, in the beginning then of the RCMP, they first of all then gave up the land that they had in Canada, and it was for 1.5 million, and the land took up parts of Saskatchewan, Alberta, Quebec, Ontario, and the Northwest Territories. So that land was given up, and when they withdrew the land and the fur trading was stopped, they thought then that would make room for settlement. But of course, it made room for something else. It made room for whiskey traders, people hunting wolves, and other ill-advised activities. And so trouble began with the native people, not only because the fur trading was kind of coupling with their life and the buffalo, but now that that was gone, then it was going to change, and so on. After Manitoba was started, a colonel from Ottawa was sent out, and he said that in order to establish law and order, they would have to have about 500 law-enforcing people to cover such a large piece of land from Manitoba to BC. To patrol all of that would take all of those people. The government said, no way, it's going to be too expensive at this time. The Cypress Hill Massacre in 1873, where 20 Assiniboine Indians and 1 American wolfer were killed, was the beginning of the struggle that made people see, made the government see, that we indeed have to have somebody out west that is going to say, stop. And believe it or not, those 20 Indian people and the single wolfer and other deaths that would have come later were from stealing of 1 horse. So it just was going to snowball and get worse and worse and worse. Fortunately, MacDonald had already been thinking about a force out west, and several days before that massacre, they had indeed passed a law to start the Northwest Mounted Police. The original desire was to call the Mounted Police the Mounted Rifles. That was the name they were going to use. But because the Civil War was just over, they thought that wasn't the best name, and so the Northwest Mounted Police was the name that they took. The Governor General gave assent, and if the men that were hired, they had 300 of them at the beginning, they would sign on for 3 years, and at the end of that 3 years, if they were in good conduct, they would receive 160 acres of free land for their offering to the country. To be qualified, they'd have to be 18 to 45. They would receive $1 per day, and they would get all the clothing and travel provided. Enlisted men of groups of 3 groups of 50, first of all, traveled from Toronto by steamer, went to Thunder Bay, and then walked the other 450 miles to Lower Fort Garry. Extensive training took place because many of them, when they enlisted, said we could ride a horse, but we could not. And so therefore, they had to be trained in horse riding when they got to Lower Fort Garry. Another trip was made by Colonel French, who was the leader of the RCMP at the time. He went to Ontario and Quebec and the Maritimes to interview the other 150 people needed for the job. Out of those people, 4 came from, I just thought it was interesting, the breakdown. 115 came from Ontario, 10 from Quebec, 4 from Nova Scotia, 2 from Manitoba, 1 from France, 43 from Great Britain, 20 from Ireland. Germany, there was 7, and there was 16 from the United States. 214 were officers, 244 horses. They left from Toronto and went by train to Fargo. Then they had to walk from Fargo, the 253 miles, to Lower Fort Garry to meet the other troops, and that took 5 days. Like each of these little things, like I say, we can hardly walk to the store. So it's just unbelievable to hear these feats of accomplishment at each leg of the carry-on. The full force then gathered in June 20th of 1874 at Fort Dufferin, and the march would begin. The force was no larger at that time than the one that 2 years later, to the exact day, would be killed at the Custer massacre that you own a little bighorn. There was no more soldiers in that group than there was at that embattlement. And the youngest member of the force at that time was a 15-year-old Fred Bagley, and they follow him in many books and tell what he did, and he raised in the ranks, and he's kind of a hero for the groups. It was interesting, the night before they took off, there was a thunderstorm, and such a violent one. They had 308 horses tethered quite securely, I was sure, because the weather was looking bad. 250 of them escaped in the night, and so they had to round them up. Now, it wasn't just get them at the end of the little wire fence. They went as far as 80 kilometers away. The RCMP would do nothing until they got all of those horses. They found them all, except one. The ghost horse of the Mounties. Very interesting poem and story about the horse that got away. Now, and later in the preparation, it was decided that their red uniforms would be used so that it would be much like the British Army. They did not want the blue or the gray like the United States. The native people had a picture of what that meant. Later, brown uniforms were used for duties and red became for only ceremonial. On that day before they left, they were dressed in those red uniforms, and it was the first time and the last time that the whole force of the RCMP were dressed in one uniform, one red uniform, marching in one place. In the years to come, they would be spread across the country. Never again would they be there. And so what a sight. And this is what you've got to do when you think about history. You've got to get a picture in your mind of what that might have looked like. And then you start to enjoy what real history is about. They decided then that they would start their patrol and get on their way. And the march, as it says here, was an example of perseverance in the face of adversity. These 300 men were trying to do an impossible task. They were going to patrol 1,005,000 miles per year, and for decades they were the only civil servants in the West. They did everything. They found people lost in blizzards. They carried mail. They did custom duties. They, of course, tracked down Lawless and got their man. On July 8th, a 2.5 mile procession started out from Fort Whoop-Up near the present day, started out from 4 Fort Whoop-Up from the present day Emerson. French counted in his diary that there was Division A with dark horses and 13 wagons, Division B with dark brown horses with portable forges and field kitchens, Division C on bright chestnut horses with 2 9-pound muscles loading guns, 2 mortars, artillery, and munition wagons. Division D on gray horses, E on black horses, F on light bay horses, 114 red river carts, 73 wagons, several mowing machines to make hay as they went, 310 horses, 142 oxen, 93 cattle to eat on the way. So quite a parade of characters and creatures. And it reached half a mile, 2.5 miles. But this would become longer, and we'll explain that later. They followed the Boundary Commission Trail at the beginning and arrived at the Bow Rivers. And upon the arrival in the west, the troop would split up, and some would go to Edmonton and some would go to other locations. French moved his troops out early in the morning, sometimes at 3 a.m. They wanted to miss the midday heat and the bugs that tormented both man and animal. A lofty goal at the beginning was 26 miles a day. Well, that soon dwindled to 19 or less. Following the July 8th departure, they covered 270 miles by the 24th and arrived at Rock Pierce and the Souris River. A 4-day span of rest was taken so animal and man could relieve their suffering and the sickness and the bugs. Grasshoppers descended on everything at that point and ate the paint off the wagons. So you know what else they got, everything else. There was a 90-degree heat, and thunderstorms blew the tents again and stampeded the horses in the same manner at the beginning of the trail. Hail was walnut size. It was no holiday. Mosquitoes left men's faces, and animals' flanks streaked with blood. The oil of juniper was found from the native people to relieve the stings. Henry Julian, an artist, described the mosquitoes this way. Simply dreadful. Your eyes and your nose and your ears were invaded. If you opened your mouth to curse them, they trooped into it. They insulated themselves under your clothes, down your shirt collar, up any sleeves, between the buttons of your shirt and your stomach. You can brush them off with your coat, but they stick in layers. Often in the evening when the tents are pitched and we went down to the brook to water our horses, hoping this would be our last work for the day, it turned into a sweet night's rest. The mosquitoes would rise in columns out of the spongy soil near the river and invade us again. Our horses would rear and pitch and kick. They were so tired of them. We would be covered in scratches and blood. Our only refuge was to run our horses to their pickets, then hasten to throw ourselves on the ground and cover ourselves with several blankets, lest they bite through them all. So that was written by Henry Julian, and I didn't get a chance to put them up, but he was a Montreal reporter. In those days, you didn't have the Inquirer or people to take pictures, and so therefore he came as an artist and drew pictures all the way along the trail. And I have copies of those pictures. He has a drawing of the storm the night they left. He has a drawing when they got to this place and this place. So there were little postcards, so to say, as they went along the way on their trip. Another enemy of their health was the dust. Now, we know dust, but their eyes were sore, red, cut, and bleeding. Their lips chapped. There was nothing to solve the problem. They did have a doctor with them, the first and only surgeon that the Mounties would have. Later, he got an assistant. They had a veterinarian to look after the animals, to look after them all. After Rock Pierce on July 29th, they went further. And they came now to the area which they would not be able to follow the trail because it dipped down further into the United States, and they wanted to stay within Canadian lands. And so therefore they had an even tougher time than they had already. After 2 weeks at Old Wives Lake and a creek that would become to be called Cripple Creek, 28 horses, 7 men, 14 wagons, and some cattle, all disabled beyond moving, were left on the wayside. And who knows what happened to them. So just those few small things, that it just starts to get more difficult right away. The United Force now split apart, heading for winter locations, as that was the next problem. Would they even get to the Edmonton area before winter? News arrived from Fort Dufferin, and it didn't make them feel any better. An officer who had caught up to them because they were starting to go slower and slower brought newspapers from Dufferin to them. They had American newspapers. The American newspapers had been reporting that the entire force had been wiped out by native people. Prayers were being said in churches frequently across the United States for the poor souls that lost their way and their lives. So just imagine even you're on that trip and you just find out you're dead. I mean, it's just not a fun time. And their families are back home. They can't send a postcard. They don't have a phone that they can email back.